Hello, everyone. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock. This is Starfleet Tactical. I am Chris Weave. I am here with my intrepid producer, Lissa.
Hello.
Who is above and beyond the call of duty to be here tonight because she's a little under the weather.
Yeah.
But it's not anything like, I don't know, the global pandemic or anything.
I tested positive for COVID, guys.
So, and I will admit, one of the things that I thought about when she had tested positive, has Stogie had it yet?
I don't know, actually.
Okay, because Crystal had it, right?
I think so. I know Alec had it.
Alec had it, and I think Crystal had it. I'm not sure. Pat's had it. So I think they're coming for me next.
Aiming your way.
Yeah. So, but as you can tell, Lissa is obviously feeling well enough that she's wasting her Saturday night on the show with us. So thank you very much for that. But my guess is that even though that she's sick, she's not so sick to become delusional and think that I'm speaking for my employer tonight. Would that be accurate?
Exactly.
So yeah, I continue to not speak for my employer tonight. So, but I am sorry that she's sick. Pat is fine. Pat is just being social. I think he's actually hanging out with his wife tonight, which that's perfectly acceptable. So we've been trying to the plan as things sort of loosen up, and Pat's schedule has become a little problematic because one weekend a month he's in Atlanta doing reserve stuff, and he can't always tell whether he's going to have Wi-Fi, and there's occasionally forced fun he has to do, which is the sort of thing that happens when you go someplace to do your reserve duty as opposed to you're just in your normal location. And so that's an issue, and his so that's worth throwing up there. It is possible that I could speak for an employer under certain circumstances. But I do make it a point when I go to cons that I list my affiliation as the Society for the Conservation of Angular Momentum, which is something that I once accidentally created, totally, literally by accident. But let's see, where was I? So one of the things that Pat and I have talked about doing is trying to sort of revamp the show a little bit, because otherwise, so that it's not me just talking all the time. And so the plan is to start like having guests come on the show, like our authors that I can interview, because I know a lot of authors who write military science fiction. So I can bring authors on the show, and I can, I've got a friend who's potentially going to co-host once a month. And then Pat will be on once a month, and then I'll do a solo presentation the remaining time. I just haven't gotten around. The ball's in my court, as usual on this show. If we've talked about doing something and it hasn't been done, it's because Chris hasn't done it yet. So it's totally and completely my fault. We'll do it. But I'm actually feeling a lot better, so I've got more energy to do stuff like that, and so that's what I'm trying to do.
That's good.
So, so you got paged for dinner? Is that what happened?
Yeah. So my dad. So we're not yelling up the stairs because my parents also tested positive. Because my mom was in a car with me for several hours on the way from Florida. So of course she tested positive, but after my dad tested positive. But we have walkie-talkies.
So, but that's not because you're quarantining from each other.
No, not anymore. Originally it was.
Yeah, until everybody came down.
Yeah, like as of this morning, last night, everyone tested positive in the household. So, but I was just hiding in this room, being like, "Stay the fuck away from me." Like, I know you stayed in a car with me for several hours, but right now you're not testing positive. So I'm not going to expose you more and make it more likely for you to test positive.
Yeah, it's that it's weird how this stuff works. I went to a work meeting, and of that meeting, it was described. There was like 10 out of 25 people ended up. It was a 2-day meeting. 10 out of 25 people tested positive. The joke was every other person tested positive, because it really was kind of how it worked out. The guy to my left didn't test positive. The guy, I don't know about day 1, there was one person to my right. And then day 2, he and the woman next to him switched places, and she was next to me. I had lunch with both of them on day 1. She tested positive. So I had lunch with, an hour-long lunch with somebody that tested positive. And, the farthest she was ever away from me was about 4 feet.
Yeah.
For, 7 hours that first day. And then I was gone in the morning and came back in the afternoon. And I never got it. Tested multiple times. So.
Well, I think what it is I probably got exposed to Omicron, because that one, because I'm triple vaxxed, and I almost always like have a mask on, like unless I'm outside, like I'll have a mask on, or like if you're eating dinner, like obviously you can't eat and have a mask on.
I usually have a mask in my pocket. I don't always wear it.
Yeah, I've got a mask in my purse at all times.
If I'm with people that are wearing a mask, I'll put the mask on. If I find myself in a room, at the very least, I'll say, I see that you're wearing a mask and I'm not wearing a mask. Would you be more comfortable if I put the mask on? The last time I said that to somebody, he said, no, I'm wearing a mask because I was exposed. So I'm not uncomfortable with you not wearing a mask. You might be uncomfortable with you not wearing a mask, but good guy, boss's deputy, boss's deputy, good guy. So he was part of the project from hell. I may have mentioned it last week that I had a bunch of 12-hour days recently, and he was one of the people who was part of it. Yeah, Donnie. Hey, Donnie. A lot of people. Donnie made the comment that he wears his mask this afternoon to his optometry appointment. My allergist requires masks. All the doctors still require masks. So
yeah,
I get to do a bunch of doctor stuff next week. Nothing, all routine. I've got all my routine doctor's appointments have lined up. So I've got 2 doctor's appointments next week, one the week after, one the week after, one the week after, and it's all routine. It's just, like I've got one with a ENT person, and I think one of those is with one of my cardiologists. I have 2 cardiologists, so.
Well, like when I tested, apparently the viral load was large enough in my system that like within a couple of minutes, like that red line was pretty solid on this test. I was like, oh.
TJ points out medical masks are a state level thing in Ohio. I've actually been reasonably impressed with how well Ohio has handled all of this. They've been pretty good about stuff. And so TJ actually lives about, I think 20 minutes north of me, maybe a half hour if you round it up.
Don't get me started on Georgia. Don't get me started on my state.
Yeah. So, yep. Yep. Didn't see any masks when I was down in Florida. So, or Southern Alabama. I was in the Southern Alabama part of Florida. So, let's see. Okay, so
the Panhandle.
The Panhandle, like almost as far west as you can get. Like right next to. Actually, I live very close to TJ. I was very close to Wright Sublette down there.
Yeah,
he lives in that neighborhood too. So like when we went out to dinner, he pointed out that all the gasoline in that part of Florida comes in through this one dock. They don't have pipelines. It just all comes in by ship, by barge to this one dock that we like parked across the street from. And it's not a very big dock. It's really not. It's really kind of weird how some places do stuff, but. So, oh well. Let's see. So, okay. I'm trying to think if there's any. I have this feeling I'm forgetting something, and I can't. Oh yeah, Bingo. Remember. All right. So most of you are probably familiar with something called Humble Bundle. Humble Bundle. Try saying that 3 times fast. I can't even say it once fast. Humble Bundle currently has a Star Trek bundle under books, and it's all the techie stuff. So it's like Star Trek shipyards. There's a couple of shipyards. There's a couple of the illustrated handbooks. There's all 5 volumes of designing starships. I think there's only 5. And the shipyards of the Klingon fleet, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of stuff there. There's some other stuff that I personally don't really care about, like, for instance, the Star Trek cocktail book. But it's 22 books that it's pay what you want. To get all 22, you have to put in like $25 or something. I think I paid $30 and got $628 worth of books. Now,
broke it into
what?
I copied the link that you had sent in the group chat, and because of text limits on YouTube, it broke it into 2 comments.
Let me try. So I just put it in there because there's always that part at the end that you can usually just sort of chop off. So I had it ready to be chopped off. So I just put it in the chat. And so, okay, so it's so first of all, I'm not getting paid to do any of this. Like, I don't know if they know what Axanar is. Whatever. I'm just a fan of some of that work.
Well, also Humble Bundle, for those who are unaware, Humble Bundle actually, when you buy through them, a portion of the sale actually goes to a variety of charities.
Yeah.
So not only are you often getting a discount on whatever you're buying, you're also able to have some of that money go towards good causes.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of it goes back to the original publishers and stuff. And people point out, well, not that much goes to charity. So like you pay $30, and it told me that something like $2.50 of what I did to charity. But you know what?
That's still $2.50 that accrues.
And again,
you're saving money most of the time.
$2.50 out of the $30 I spent to get $628 worth of books.
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, all right, roger that, right? I mean, it's the way I look at it is I got a really, really good deal, and it's even better that some of it goes to charity. If I wanted just to do the charity portion, I just do the charity portion.
Exactly.
It just makes it
like,
a little bit.
This is something I was buying already.
Yep. It's a cherry on top. It's a cherry
on top. It just happens to be the case that some of it's going to charity and going to good causes. Like, where they have a list of the actual, like,
they usually list it for each individual thing, and the download one and this one was pretty easy. I did the Starfinder one not too long ago for the Starfinder RPG, and it was a total and complete pain in the ass to download it because it all went through Paizo, and to download the stuff from Paizo, you had to click on it once and then wait 2 minutes and then click on it again.
The charities that they work with
definitive list
are Charity Water, Girls Who Code, World Reader, Children's Miracle Network Hospitals, One Tree Planted, the ACLU, Special Effect, the Gamers Charity, Make-A-Wish, and they are currently featuring the Global Food Banking Network.
Yep, so all good stuff. But in any event, this is just a public service announcement. This special runs for like another 20 days, 25 days, something like that.
Yep.
So just to let y'all know, 19 days, something like that. I forget what it was. Just to let y'all know. So, okay, let's see. Let's go ahead and start. We've talked a little bit longer. So, bye, Alyssa. Bye. Okay, so we're going to continue the discussion that we've been having. Oh, I forgot. I'm not doing this in PowerPoint. I'm doing it in the other one. So a few announcements. None of this is new. other than I'm just sort of behind in everything. There's definitely not going to be a show next week. I've decided I'm not going to. I just want to be honest, I just want the flexibility of not having to worry about making it back in time to do the show, because on Saturday, I'm actually going to be in Columbus, which is about an hour and a half away, to do a couple of talks that you guys have seen. I'm doing my What the U.S. Navy Taught Me About Starfleet talk, and I'm doing the Starship Troopers talk at the the Origins Wargaming Convention, Wargaming Game Fair, in downtown Columbus. And so I just don't want to have to run back to do the presentation, because I want to keep open the option that if I run into somebody I know, I can have dinner with them or something like that. So no show next week, but I should be back the week after that. And I'm pretty good for at least the beginning of July. It looks like at some point in July, I'm going to have to go to Las Vegas again, but it's not clear exactly when that's going to be. And we'll see if that changes or not, because the people that project keeps changing. So I've been going through doing this naval combat series, and we've now gotten to the point where we're going to do Karl Lautenschlager. And this is going to end up being 2 parts, because he did 2 articles. One of them is mostly about ships. One of them is mostly about fleets. And we're going to talk about both of them. I think they're worth spending some time on. And as I said last time, this is not about, I don't think that the right answer is to take a look at this stuff and go, my science fiction space navy needs to look exactly like that. This is about understanding how real world naval combat has evolved, what the things are that are important when you're thinking about real world naval combat, so that when you look at something science fiction wise, you can either be an intelligent consumer of it, and you can sort of you can get that extra level of enjoyment by being able to compare it to the real world and seeing where it's different. Or by, if you want to produce your own stuff, like if you're a writer or something, by understanding how you can think through those problems. Now, like I said last time, I'm a big fan of Warhammer 40K. And the very, very first time that Alec and I got together on YouTube, we spent 90 minutes geeking out over Warhammer 40K. There's not a damn thing in that universe that makes the least amount of sense. So I'm totally and completely okay with people liking stuff that doesn't make sense, up to and including just filing the serial numbers off and saying, putting in space on the end and saying, I'm going to do World War II in space, or the Korean War in space, or, giant space galleons with giant space sails, whatever you want to do, that's great. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more in depth, that sort of tries to engage you intellectually, I'm a big believer in, you should, if you want people to think, if the media producer wants me to think, they have to give me good thoughts. Alec and I both love Field of Dreams. It's one of my favorite movies. And I'm with him. If I'm flipping through the television and it's on, I'll stop and watch it. It's a fantastic movie. Not a damn thing in that movie makes any sense. But it's okay, because they don't ask me to engage it at an intellectual level. I engage it at an emotional level. The Matrix I find to be a lot more flawed as a movie, because it tries to be a thinking person's movie, but a lot of those thinking are really kind of dumb. So, David, thank you very much for the super chat. We appreciate that. Alec appreciates that, because all that goes to Alec and supporting the Axanar channel. So let's see, moving on. Okay, I want to do a little bit of cleanup from last week, because as I've said in the past, I always listen to the show again. And I was listening to the show earlier today, and I spent a lot of time going like, oh, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. So the first thing is, I said torpedo boat a lot when I was specifically thinking torpedo boat destroyer in my head. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, but the 5-second version is, people invented torpedo boats. Then they took basically that idea of a torpedo boat, made it into a much bigger ship, made it a torpedo boat destroyer to protect against torpedo boats. And then in one of the great ironies of history, somebody said, hey, let's put torpedoes on that. And now the torpedo boat destroyer became a torpedo boat. It not only destroyed other torpedo boats, but it became a torpedo boat itself. So if you go back and you listen to it, when I'm talking about small ships, slow ships, et cetera, I'm talking about torpedo boats, but eventually that sort of morphed into torpedo boat destroyers. I also sort of tripped up a little bit on the gun range versus speed thing, and that's because I was thinking about a particular stat that had a particular set of assumptions going into it, and I wasn't quite remembering exactly what my assumptions are, so I sort of tripped over myself a little bit. So I decided it was worth putting together these little charts here so we could talk about it just a tiny little bit more than we did previously. So here's a couple of charts. Let me make them a little bit bigger so I can see them a little better. On the right, we have different ship classes, different U.S. battleship classes, the 5 most recent battleship classes, not including the Montana, which they had laid down. I'm trying to remember if they actually laid any of them down. Maybe they got to the point where I think where they were like clearing the dock and maybe put a spine down, put a keel down, but they didn't get any further than that. They certainly didn't get any further than that. So I can't remember if they even got that far. They had a couple of Iowas that they canceled on the ways too. The Iowa could go a maximum speed of about 33 knots, that class, and it could shoot for about 20. TJ points out the Montana wasn't actually laid down. I think I'm thinking of the Kentucky, which was one of the Iowas. It was laid down, and eventually they ended up kind of bow off to put it on the Wisconsin when the Wisconsin had a little accident. It ran into something. So in any event, Iowa, 33 knots, 20 nautical miles, and it had the 16-inch 50 Mark 7 gun. South Dakota, class right before it, slower, 27 knots, and it could shoot about 18 nautical miles. It had the 16-inch 45. The reason why it shot a little bit less was mostly because it was a lighter shell with a smaller charge, I think. But one of the things to keep in mind about all of these numbers, there's basically an asterisk next to everything in that chart, except the names of the ships. Everything else has an asterisk next to it because, for instance, when you get back to those, first of all of the ships underwent some sort of refit during the war. For the late model ships, it was relatively light. They just put on like more anti-aircraft guns and stuff like that. For the earlier ships, they underwent a shit ton of refit over the course of the 20 years before the war started. They refitted them a lot of times, and they upgraded the guns. Basically, I think the Mark I later got turned into the Mark V on the Colorados, if I remember correctly. But they made changes to the guns. They didn't take them out. They just made changes to the guns, and they declared it to be the Mark V. There's lots of changes that happened with various gear inside, and they for some of those they changed the turrets so they could shoot farther, because early on, this is going to be a talk about fire control. Early on, when they didn't think that they could shoot them at range, so they didn't bother to make them able to elevate to shoot at their maximum range, because you couldn't hit anything at maximum range, so we're never going to take that shot. Then our fire control got better. We had dramatic improvements in fire control, and when that happened, then we could hit at range. So we did. So we made changes to make it work. So chart on the left, right? So if you're going at 10 knots and your gun range is 10 nautical miles, it takes you an hour to get to where the shell splash was, right? Moving at 10 nautical miles an hour, you're shooting 10 nautical miles. It's going to take you an hour to get there. Half the amount of time if you're moving at 20 knots, 20 minutes if you're moving at 30 knots, right? So at 20 nautical miles, if you're moving at 10 knots, it takes 2 hours to get to where that goes. Now, are you hitting at 20 nautical miles? No. And these numbers are rough approximations, right? It depends upon how much charge you put in, depends upon sea state, some other things like that. I think the gun and when I converted to nautical miles, I basically just took the yards and divided by 2, which is a little bit imprecise, but all of these numbers have an asterisk next to them anyway, and I wasn't going to bother sitting down with the calculator and calculating everything out when I knew I was going to round the number anyway when I got done. So, everything's got some error brackets on it, but it's about 20 nautical miles for maximum range for that gun. 39,000 yards is what is listed. It takes you approximately 120 minutes at 10 knots. So if you look at the Tennessee and the Colorado, they're 21 knots. That's their top speed. You're not going to be maneuvering at that speed. That's not how fast your battle line is going to be going when you're going into combat, because you want to maintain a speed reserve so that ships that are out of position can get in position. If everybody's going at their top speed, you can never actually get to their you can never actually get caught up. So the end result of that is it takes a long time to get to where the shell splash is, which is totally and completely different from Star Trek. Weapon ranges on Star Trek are very, very, very short. The exception to that is photon torpedoes at warp, which you always see being used in stern chases. So even though the distance between the ships isn't that great, you're moving at warp speed. So the torpedo actually goes a huge distance, but it's still only going to shoot for 10 seconds, right? It's got 10 seconds of run time. It's just at 10 seconds because it's fired at warp. Now, I'll note there's a really good analog to that in beyond visual range air combat. And I'm going to talk about that at some point, but a little preview to that. You should never just talk about the maximum range of an AMRAAM missile, for instance, because the speed and altitude is part of the range and speed of that. If you're flying high and you're flying very fast, the missile goes faster because the engine burn goes on top of what it was doing, and it goes farther. So if you launch that missile at Mach 1.5, so it starts out going Mach 1.5 and the engine pushes it faster. And so that, in a lot of ways, that's how photon torpedoes at warp work. They have the sustainer field that comes with the that the launcher puts on it, and as a result, it gets that speed bonus. So David Coxwell says, "How about phase torpedoes?" I'm not gonna get into the various specific types of weapons because I don't remember all the details of that. If Pat were here, Pat would be jumping in at this point to talk about that. But I'm not going to go there just because I don't want to say something that's going to be technically wrong. So, okay, so let's see. Okay, so TJ says, I'm missing the laid down South Dakotas. Yeah, so there was a South Dakota class in between the Colorado class and the North Carolinas that were laid down, but they were all scrapped. I didn't include them because they never actually ended up commissioned. Those dates are the commissioning date, not the launch date, not the laid down date. It's the actual commissioning date, which is why Iowa is so late. So basically, if you subtract a year or so off of those dates, that's when they actually ended up in the water and they started doing trials and stuff. But that's when they actually entered the fleet, is that date there. So I just didn't include them. Okay, so all right, so this is pretty much stuff I've already said before. These are the documents that I'm going through, and I think they're all excellent illustrations about how to think about naval combat. And we see a lot of science fiction that's based on naval models. So let's go ahead and talk about some naval models. So that's what we're in the process of doing with this series. Okay, tonight I'm going to talk about Karl Lautenschlager. So there's a little biographical essay. I found this little biography. I'd never seen a biography of the man before. I've been reading his stuff for 15 years, and I didn't have any idea what he looked like until I found this photo from 1980. My guess is he doesn't look quite like that anymore. He's now retired from the Los Alamos National Lab. He wrote a handful of articles in the 1980s. He wrote a few stuff later on. My guess is he wrote a whole bunch of top secret stuff, but he was writing stuff for international security and some other historical conferences and stuff in the 1980s about naval warfare. And specifically about technology and the development of naval warfare. There's two that I single out here. The Dreadnought Revolution Reconsidered, which was a paper for a history symposium done the U.S. Naval Academy. And then his article, Technology and the Evolution of Naval Warfare from 1983. So the 1987 article and the 1983 article. These articles overlap. I'm not strictly going to do the first one of the two articles, but the first one is mostly about revolution in ships, and the second one is mostly about revolution in fleets. So I'm going to talk about the ship level changes. I've already given you some of the context of this, and I've already given you 2 years ago-ish some of the background on this, or some of the how this stuff has impacted my thoughts. You may recall back anytime I talked about history, hiding, and hydrodynamics, when I'm talking about the history of ship development and how we went from having line of battle ships and then auxiliaries that didn't fight in the battle to having a fleet where you had escorts that were actually part of the battle, even though they weren't part of the battle line per se, but they had a role in the battle. They weren't just watching the battle like the auxiliaries were. Whenever I talk about that, Karl Lautenschlager is the guy who it crystallized all that in my head. So a lot of that comes out of my reading of Karl Lautenschlager. So he's the source for a lot of that stuff. Tonight I'm going to talk about ships. Next week I'm going to talk about fleets. So let's talk about the revolution, evolution, maybe both, in naval combat. So let's talk a little bit about ships and the sort of the nature of that revolution. Total and complete rewriting of the world between 1907 and 1914. Now, you'll note Dreadnought goes in the water, starts construction in 1903, goes in the water, launched in 1906. Why 1907? Why that time period? Well, Lautenschlager also specifically talks in terms of like one ship does not a revolution make, right? So he actually gets into things like, when do you have the first squadron, the first 4-ship element of ships? Because that's really, one ship, what do you do with one ship? But when you got a bunch of ships together, then you can sort of say, they work together, and now that's how the things work. Where you draw the exact line here is really kind of fuzzy. You can maybe make the argument that 1907 doesn't cut it because you only have like 4 ships at this point for the Brits. Maybe you need to wait until like right on the verge of war where you've actually got a battle fleet. But they were cranking them out like sausages as fast as they could. We very quickly got to that point. And the important part is you go back earlier than about 1905-ish. You've got pre-dreadnoughts that operate one way, and then after that, you fast forward 10 years, you've got dreadnoughts, and they operate a totally different way. And they operate in a totally different way, not because of what the conventional wisdom says, that HMS Dreadnought represent this technological watershed by implementing all this new technology, because that is just plain false. The technology was not new. None of it. None of it was new. It was all stuff that had been in the fleet before. Some of it was stuff that they've been trying to perfect for 100 years. And they finally got it right. So the technology wasn't new, and it also wasn't just the dreadnoughts. That technology went to other places too, and we'll talk about that. But what you did see there was a dramatic increase in combat power because of these 2 forms of systems integration that I'm going to talk about tonight. One is combining a whole bunch of technologies that improve fire control and gives you the gunnery capability of a dreadnought battleship. And the second is turning the torpedo boat into the torpedo boat destroyer, and then beefing up the torpedo boat destroyer to the point where it is a vital element in support of the battle line. It's not really in the battle line, but it's in support of the battle line. So let's do a little background on dreadnought battleships. Why are they called dreadnought battleships? Because they're named after the HMS Dreadnought. And so the name just stuck. The USS Michigan was proposed beforehand. If Michigan had gotten in the water earlier, we might be calling them Michigans instead of dreadnoughts. Probably not. Dreadnought sounds better. They were characterized by relatively high speed and all big gun armament. Now, does that mean they didn't have any smaller guns? No. I'm talking about the main battery. Right? talking about the thing that you shoot at other capital ships. They had all sorts of smaller guns. They had smaller guns to shoot at torpedo boats. They had smaller guns. Later on, they had smaller guns to shoot at airplanes, although that wasn't a big thing early on. They had plenty of smaller guns, but it's about the main battery. It's about what you're going to use to kill other ships. Before this time period, it wasn't unusual to have shorter range guns that were quick firing guns, and then you'd have a few big guns, etc. Those big guns are pretty much the same guns that you see on the Dreadnought and her sister ships. They're pretty damn similar. The thing that changed wasn't the gun. The thing that changed was the number of guns and how they went about shooting them, and all the supporting technology. So a few quotes from Lautenschlager's article here. Integrated components of a centralized gunnery control system gave the new Dreadnought-type battleship twice the effective fighting range and at least twice the hitting power of the latest pre-Dreadnoughts. When those shells hit, they did a shit ton of damage. It was the first linking of several dissimilar components in a warship to give its weapon significantly improved capabilities. At the same time, these components became interdependent, making each essential to the whole. Whereas many guns of the pre-Dreadnought operated independently, the big guns of the Dreadnought functioned as a single system. That is critical. I'm going to spend a bunch of time talking about that. And with this system integration, battleships could shoot with consistent accuracy at twice the range possible with decentralized on-mount fire control. This extended effective engagement distances from between 5,000 to 7,000 yards to between 10,000 to 14,000 yards. You could shoot twice as far and get the same number of hits because they were able to put more guns on because they didn't waste their time with all these littler guns. They, in effect, were able to put twice as many guns on the ship. So same gun, same hit rate, twice the distance, twice the number of hits, because twice the number of guns. That's a dramatic improvement. We're going to talk more about that. So what are the components of this new type of gunnery control that he talks about? Well, the first one is single observer optical rangefinders. So rather than people just sort of guessing how far it is, putting up binoculars, going, I think it's about 1,000 yards, they had optical rangefinders. Now, this is a problem they'd been working on for 100 years. Took a while to get it right, but they've been working on it forever. They had tried doing systems where you've got an observer at one end at the front bow of the ship and an observer at the tail of the ship, and they use trigonometry to figure out the distance based upon the angle from those two observers. Looks good on paper, doesn't work well in practice, even with some of the communication techniques that I'm going to talk about later on that made all this work. It just, you had to do the math fast. You've got lookup tables, etc. You just didn't really give you good capabilities. What they finally ended up doing was prism-based binoculars, and they'd have a big tube that went out. They started at about 5 feet, and then later they went to 9 feet or larger. And you've got basically binoculars with a great deal of parallax between them, right? Parallax is the distance between your eyes. Right? The reason why we have three-dimensional vision is because our eyes are not like one right on top of the other. They're side by side, and we've got two of them. And so our brains calculate the distance in effect, right? Our brains understand that there's a distance, and we see stuff in 3 dimensions as a result of that. When you get these large baselines, you're able to get the range better. Bearing is hard when ships are maneuvering, but bearing is relatively easy when they're not maneuvering. Like, think about it. It's right over there, right? It's easy for me to point directly at something. It's harder to say it is exactly this amount of range. So that was the hard part, is doing the range stuff. So the second thing they did is gunfire spotting, and that includes setting up their shots so there's a straddle. This is really kind of a doctrine thing, right? I talked a lot about doctrine. Setting up their ships, their shots so there's a straddle, and then using spotting tops to replace fighting tops. So basically you put people up high in the top of the ship, and they're looking down with binoculars, and they can say, that one was too long, that one was too short, et cetera, et cetera. It gave them a much better viewpoint than just having on-mount guys with the gun going, oh, it looked like it was close to here, right? So that helped a great deal. And because you were firing them all at once, you didn't have the guys going, was that our shell or was that their shell? Was our shell short or was our shell long, right? So it helped a great deal. Before that, you had fighting tops. What do I mean by fighting tops? Well, they weren't as high up. They were closer, but it was guys with machine guns. And the idea is that they'd fire the machine guns at ships, at torpedo boats that came in, right? They were little point defense things. Well, as the ranges extended, they had a range of like 1,000 yards, 2,000 yards, something like that. As the range extended, those guys didn't have anything to do anymore, right? So they replaced them. They got rid of them because it was much more useful to use that space to have spotting tops. Excuse me. Oh, Rob Davidoff says, I love the coloration for shell splash. Yeah, that was like a 1930s thing, late 30s, early 40s, where they would put different colored dye in the different ships' shells so that you could say, oh, that's a green splash, that's ours. That's a blue splash, that must be them. And that's one of the reasons why we know that a U.S. Admiral, Admiral Cunningham, if I remember correctly, was killed in a blue-on-blue incident because the flag bridge got hit by a shell and there was like green dye everywhere, and their sister ship had shells with green dye. So the coloration stuff, all that stuff, all those techniques in order to improve the accuracy was really, really cool. Third thing, electrical communications. Okay, back in the old days, you had voice tubes. And you'd yell down the voice tube. And you've got big ass guns firing and crashing of equipment and shells, and it's loud, and you're trying to yell down this tube, and the guy on the other end is trying to hear. And guess what your throughput rate is? It's pretty shitty. And so as a result of that, you didn't really have the option of coordinating those guns. The best you could do is sort of say, all right, main battery release, everybody fire. That's about as good as you can do. You can maybe say, concentrate on this ship, but that's about it. You weren't passing data back and forth. It's just not going to happen. You electrify those ships. Thank you, Admiral Fisk, for electrifying the United States Navy. You electrify those ships, and now you can use telephones. You could use telegraphs. Remember the engine telegraph thing? You can do the same thing to send information on range, to send information on bearing. You can send all that stuff around, and then the final thing you can do is everybody gets their gun set, sets it together, and one guy pushes a button. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's director spotting. One guy pushes a button and they all shoot. So that's part of director spotting. One guy pushes the button, they all shoot, which means when they're spotting later on, they don't have to do that. Is that my shot or their shot? Because they're all firing as one, they're doing the straddle, and they're calculating all the distances, and it dramatically increased the number of hits they got, despite the fact that they're shooting twice as far as they were before. So uniform caliber main battery of big guns, right? So same guns as the pre-dreadnoughts, but they're firing them all together. That uniform caliber aided spotting. The firing all together aided spotting. And because you could do all the ballistic calculations were the same. You just had a little bit different based upon where they were on the ship, where the turrets were. There was a little bit difference in exactly where they were pointed, but you didn't have to worry about, well, this gun's shooting at its extreme range, so it's shooting very high, and this gun's shooting very flat. And, you had all these variations. When you had many different types of guns, you had to sort of calculate it separately for each of them. And that was hard. Now you don't. You only have to calculate it for the one gun and then just get the bearing right, and you can fire. It also meant, because they were big guns, they're firing on relatively flat trajectories. Now, that's not what ends up happening in World War II when you start extending shooting to range. Fire control got even better. It doubled again after that, and then doubled again. So now you're shooting at long distances, and you've got plunging fire. You're shooting at maximum range. But in World War I, you're shooting pretty flat. And that has the effect of increasing what they call the danger zone. They're not only shooting farther, but it increases the danger zone. Because like if you think about it, if you're shooting at a target with an arrow and the target is sort of like flat on the ground and you're having to arc it over, that's a lot harder than I'm just shooting flat and it's up against a wall. And so because of the flat trajectories, it basically meant that there was a wider, it was more tolerant of errors in range than it was if you have to do it up and over and hit the exact spot. So for World War I, that was really, really important for this time period. Finally, you've got director spotting. Telescopic gun sights had already existed for a long time. But what you added into it was the ability to do salvo firing. You've got a guy and a gun director, and he's controlling the entire thing, and he's sending the information, what the target is, etc. All the guns are sort of slave to his director, and he's pushing the button, and they all fire at once. So not a single one of these things was new. They had all been deployed in the fleet previously. In some cases, we had been like the Brits and us also had been working on optical rangefinders, trying to come up with a solution to that for decades. Bradley Fisk, Rear Admiral, a fine engineer, the guy who's responsible for electrifying the United States Navy, he had done a lot of work, and they had deployed a system where they had observers on the front and the back of the ships, and it just didn't work. When they finally got this right, it was a game changer. It was a game changer. Okay, so that's the dreadnoughts. Let's talk about the destroyers. Torpedo boats have been limited, right? They're trying to be stealthy and fast. And the problem is stealthy and fast don't really go well together. Stealthy means low freeboard, low to the water line, sort of turtle back, hard to see, hard to spot, etc. Not a whole lot of silhouette. That doesn't give you very good sea, and small also. That doesn't give you very good seakeeping capabilities. Because it doesn't have good seakeeping capabilities, the top speed endurance was pretty low, right? They were fast, but they couldn't go very far for very long, and they couldn't go very long at their top speed. So that ended up being that they were slow a lot of the time. They had limited endurance. They could sprint fast, but they couldn't maintain that sprint very long. And they just, they had trouble with seakeeping. And so, and their endurance was so poor, they're not going out with the fleet. They basically, they wave goodbye to the dreadnoughts as the dreadnoughts go over the horizon, or as the pre-dreadnoughts go over the horizon. They'd wave goodbye. They were purely a local defense force. Well, and it also meant that the effective range of quick-firing guns tended to stay ahead of the range of the torpedoes that these guys were firing. So they were every time those guys went into combat, it was going to be the Death Star trench run. And it wasn't going to be fun for them, and they were going to lose a bunch of guys. Okay, so what changed? Well, first of all, they decided to build bigger ships. And the first bigger ships just had reciprocating steam engines, and they were still slow. But people looked at it and went, okay, USS Bainbridge, not the right answer, but we're on to something here. Because when it gets bigger, you've got improved seakeeping. When it gets bigger, you can carry more fuel, which means greater range, which means, yeah, now I can deploy with the fleet. But the real killer app for this was steam turbines. Now, steam turbines, the Dreadnought had steam turbines. All the British ships had steam turbines. The capital ships on the German side, all the German dreadnoughts, both the battle cruisers and the battleships, most of them used reciprocating steam. So steam turbines is not necessarily part of the dreadnought revolution per se, but they were crucial on these small ships, totally and completely crucial, because steam turbines were a lot of power for less weight, and they could go, you got a much faster response. They ramp up a lot faster, so that made the ships more maneuverable, and they could do it for a long time. So they had higher endurance. They could push that bigger ship through the water faster, and they could, now you had a ship that was actually big enough that you could mount some guns on it, right? So it could defend itself against other small ships, and you could use it to play defense in a way that you couldn't previously. So now you've got a ship that's got two missions, right? One of the missions is offensive. It carries torpedoes and it shoots those torpedoes at capital ships. The other mission is defensive. It carries guns to shoot at other things that are trying to shoot torpedoes at your capital ships. In first Royal Navy service and then later U.S. Navy service, the English speakers all had a tendency to emphasize the defensive mission. It was about the gun line. And remember what I said about Lanning a couple of weeks ago and what Lanning's take on this, right? The purpose of the destroyers is to prevent the other guy from mucking up your gun line. It's all about the gun line. The gun line is how you're going to win. You base everything on supporting the gun line. You use your other assets to protect your gun line. Not that it can't protect itself, but that if it's trying to optimize gunfire, and if it's maneuvering or trying to deal with small threats, it's not optimizing its gunfire. So you're trying to protect your gun line, and you're trying to sub-optimize the other guy's gun line by attacking it. So you do those things, and we had a tendency to prefer, we thought first and foremost about the defensive aspect to let our gun line do its job. The continental navies, especially the Germans, especially the Kriegsmarine, thought about offense first and then defense. But, all those ships had two missions. They had a primary mission, they had a secondary mission. They both used the same two missions. It's just the only difference was which one's the offensive, which one's the primary, which one's the secondary. So they both trained for both missions. So, and also now, improved comms meant that you can now integrate this ship with the rest of the fleet, right? And the comms were electric lights, right? So you can signal, you now had, because of electricity, you had lights that were bright enough that you could use them in the daytime. And you can signal with electric lights a lot faster than you can with signal flags. You can say a lot more with electric lights than you can with signal flags. So they're doing the Aldous lamp thing, sending signals to each other. And they also had radios at this point. Now, radio in this time period, it's kind of hit or miss, right? It's not like making a phone call today. It's not like the radios that we have today, but it's way better than what they had before. And what you end up with at this point is you end up with and this is going to be something that's going to be big in the next Lautenschlager thing. You end up with the first time in human history where a fleet commander can get a report from a ship that he can't see. That is one of those things that is groundbreaking that we never think about, right? Because we're used to that. We can get a report from something that we can't see. Later on, thanks to aerial spotting and stuff like that, which I'll get into in the next show, we could shoot stuff we couldn't see, which is also groundbreaking. So that's it for the first one on Lautenschlager. But what did we learn from this? So this is a long quote. This is actually from his second article, but I think it's worth doing in its entirety. The idea of a single technological breakthrough in the military sphere is popular mythology. Important advances in naval weaponry have not come with the introduction of spectacular new technology, but with the integration of several known, often rather mundane inventions. Developments in warship and aircraft design have tended to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. But there have been several instances when combinations of technology were brought together to produce rapid change so significant that all existing combat fleets had to meet the new standard in fighting capabilities or remain hopelessly ineffective. The extent of these new capabilities was seldom reflected in obvious physical changes. In some, the key to identifying important developments for the future is to concentrate on the synthesis of different technologies and how that synthesis can produce fundamental change in mission capabilities. So, systems integration is the key. Both integration on a single platform in the case of the Dreadnought, integration between platforms in the case of having different specialized forms of ship that all take part in the battle, And there's a little bit in there that I've sort of didn't emphasize here, but he makes a point of talking about it at the beginning of the first article, and that's important changes may be very subtle to detect. Right? Can you tell if a ship has electricity? It's electrified. Can you tell if they're using clocks, telegraphs type stuff to send information to each other? You might be able, if you look real carefully, you might be able to see the optical rangefinders. And later on, when the directors had their own turret, it looked like a gun turret, except it had no gun. Later on, you could look at a ship and say that they got a director. In fact, if you think way, way, way back to the typing, naming and typing stuff that I did about a year and a half ago, you'll remember that I put up a picture of a destroyer escort and a picture of a destroyer, and they're mostly similar, except the difference is that the destroyer had a gun director and the destroyer escort did not. Meaning the destroyer escort could use all of its guns as a single weapon system. The destroyer escort had a lot harder time doing that. I presume that one of those turrets could send information to the other turret. I haven't really pulled the thread on that, though. I presume that's how that worked. Now, this is very interesting. Let's talk about science fiction a little bit. So what do we see in Star Trek? We see not a whole lot of stuff that looks just like this. The only thing, just doing a very quick think about it, the only thing I can think of is maybe kind of phaser strips of all things. Because what does a phaser strip let you do? What do you see happen in Next Gen that you didn't see happen in the earlier show? And that is that you can maintain fire for a lot longer periods of time. So basically, you take a whole bunch of emitters, you put them together, you maneuver the ship in such a way that it switches from one emitter to another. They're all charged, and as a result, that phaser shot lasts a lot longer. So in effect, what they did is they just put a bunch of little phasers and let the little phasers add up. Maybe that doesn't work. I have to think about that a little bit. Talking with Andy Presby the other day, he's of the opinion that if you look real carefully in Deep Space Nine in particular, and you look real carefully in Sternbach and Okuda, you can come to the conclusion that the reason why a lot of those ships fly in formations is that they're doing some form of shield locking. And the working hypothesis on this, there's a lot of reading between the lines here. The working hypothesis is you sort of put all the ships together, their shields are in effect kind of touching so that the ship that's not engaged, their shields are supporting the ship that is engaged. And so it basically evens the stress across multiple shields. I'm not totally convinced of that yet, but Andy is way more conversant with that than I am. So we had that conversation literally yesterday, and I haven't had the chance to pull the thread real hard on that yet. You don't usually see these sorts of things in visual media, but remember, in the old days, these things were really subtle. You couldn't really see it. In visual media, this is not the sort of thing they usually get into. But in written media, you see it a lot, right? You see this in Honor Harrington all over the place. In fact, what I really need to do is when I'm done with this, I need to do an analysis of Honor Harrington as sort of the archetypal example of bringing all these analytical techniques together. I'm going to do that. Because if you think about it, a lot of the stuff that David Weber does in Honor Harrington is they come up with a new technology to do this, and they come up with a new technology to do that. But there's a few instances where they take old stuff and they put it together, and they come up with a new answer, right? The new light attack craft that Manticore develops. So they developed a few new tech capabilities as a big ass gamma ray laser to put in the nose to take advantage of the technology they had. But they had a new type of fission reactor, old tech that was that was better than the fission stuff they had before, and it was the right answer for what they needed to do. And they used it in an innovative way to give them a dramatically new capability. And if you remember correctly, at that point, nobody thought LACs were anything important. LACs were like torpedo boats, and you used them in system and you didn't do anything with them, and they were really kind of useless. And then Honor does the thing where they convert a freighter and they put LACs on it and they send her off into the unknown, and she's got jury-rigged missile pods and she's got these LACs. And both of those turned out to be, they're all old technology, but they did some more thinking about them, and they just were really, really good. So, and the other thing is the Exordium series sort of have stuff like that that's implied. I'm going to do a talk on the Exordium series. So if you want to read Exordium, that's great. Then we'll all be on the same page. Or if you just want to wait until what I have to say, there's some stuff in the Exordium series that's sort of implied. And I actually kind of have a vote, a tiny, tiny little vote in the Exordium series, and that there's stuff that Dave Trowbridge, and Sherwood Smith is the other person who does it, but Dave is the guy who does all the Navy thinking. There's stuff that he's put in there specifically because I've made recommendations about it. So that's it for tonight, largely. What we're going to talk about next week is fleets. The second Lautenschlager article talks about how fleet combat has changed from going all the way back to starting with how it changed in World War I, where we're basically at surface combat, and then you started having submarines. Eventually, by the time you get to the modern age, he goes all the way up through the modern age and nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. I'm probably not going to go that far. But how all that changed and how range changes and all the rest of it, and how things could support each other, etc. So that's what we're going to talk about next week. And I'm pretty sure, yep, that's my last slide. So Lissa's giving me a thumbs up. Lissa, do you want to come back on?
Sure.
So Lissa, I would like to thank you very much. There was no, if you would have said, I'm sick with something that's killed 1 million Americans and I'm going to just take the night off, I would have said you should take the night off. But I appreciate the fact that you were there to handle stuff. If there's,
I slept most of the day away. Plus, I'm like triple vaxxed and everything. Like, it just feels like an annoying cold. Like, I've actually had the cold and flu worse than I have this right now. Like, legit, my diaphragm, not bruised, not like sore at all.
Okay, which is good. I'm glad you're not sore. So there was a lot of really good comments that I didn't really get to. I'll just say just a couple of really, really quick comments. One is that I generally I try to not do the entire what would win a Star Destroyer or or the Enterprise type of discussions, because I just think there's so many different technological assumptions.
I'm going to just pull up my favorite comment that we have gotten.
Go for it.
Olive, I love you.
Yeah, I saw that. That was a good one. So when I sort of look at all these, who would win a Star Trek Discovery or the Orville, I kind of look at it and go, that's sort of like saying, what's better, apple pie or a Ford F-150? Okay. I mean, they're different, right? It's apples and oranges. In fact, it's not even apples and oranges. So I generally try not to go there. And somebody else made I think it might have been Olive, made a quick comment about fighters in Star Trek and long-range missiles and stuff. I'm really skeptical about the entire idea of fighters in Star Trek. I just don't think that they make sense based upon a lot of the technological assumptions there. Now, of course, you run into the standard problem that we always run into. Which Star Trek are you talking about? Because there's 12 different versions and they don't try to be consistent. And then you got Sternbach and Okuda and, et cetera, et cetera. But even on top of that, that's actually... that question is one of the reasons why on that list of naval documents, I've got the Traveler document from Martin Doherty called Sector Fleet is because Traveler has fighters and capital ships, and how do you think about them? So does Renegade Legion Leviathan, which I've talked about in the past. And they both come up with the answer of they do different things in different situations. And it's not real. The right answer isn't to think of them as being things that you would do at the same time. That the right answer is to think of it, fighters are important in this set of scenarios, and they're not important in this other set of scenarios. And I think that actually might be the model. That's kind of the model that I'm adopting for Star Trek, right? I don't think you go into a fleet action with lots of fighters because I think those guys get eaten alive. They should get eaten alive. If the setting was consistent, they'd get eaten alive. And you know, as much as you can point to World War II as a counterexample of this, humans try not to create situations where every mission is a suicide mission. So yeah, Battle of Midway, Torpedo 8, one guy survived out of every airplane in that flight had 3 people on board. One guy total out of an entire flight of airplanes survived. That was considered to be like, yeah, that's not what we're trying to do. That wasn't considered a win for Torpedo 8. And so we really tried to not do that. And if every battle had been such a bloodbath, carriers wouldn't have been the big deal that they ended up being. Luckily, after Midway, it stopped being that kind of bloodbath. Mm-hmm. Well, for us anyway, it was for the Japanese, but it stopped being that kind of bloodbath for us. So I think that's all I got for tonight, actually. So I think that's what you're watching me do, is capture the chat so that I can go back and try to answer any questions that show up in chat. I do try to do that with the Aries Studio version of the chat. I'm way behind, but if I don't get a chance to respond to stuff in real time, I try to go back and do that later. So,
all right. Well, everyone, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
We will see you not next week, correct? But the week after?
Week after.
All right. Live long and prosper, guys. Everybody. Bye.